I think everyone's heard it. Why do they run those buses, trams, trains? They're always empty. I think this kind of argument is every transit advocate's worst nightmare, because yeah, it's really bad when buses are running around the neighborhood empty, right? Well, not quite. Let's talk about it. Okay, so now before we dive into this in more detail, if you enjoyed this video and other content I create, consider supporting the channel on Patreon. It really helps me continue making content like this. And if you can't, consider subscribing. It's free and it helps. If you're wondering why this empty bus question is something that particularly annoys me, I remember growing up in a suburban neighborhood and going to the local coffee shop. Now, our suburban bus route had recently been upgraded from every 30 minutes to every 15. And I remember all of the old patrons of the coffee shop complaining that the transit agency was wasting all of this taxpayer money running buses empty. I also remember living near one of the GO lines historically here in Toronto, and subsequently a resident who had purchased a house that was literally backing onto the railway tracks, complaining, probably because he didn't like that trains were going by more frequently than before, that the trains aren't full enough. I've also been talking about this phenomenon a bit on Twitter, and I actually touched on it in an article I wrote that I'll link in the pinned comment down below. Some people have made a good point, which is that drivers never complain when a road or highway is empty. They are just excited that they can drive faster and more dangerously, and also get to their destination more quickly. Now, to be completely fair, this isn't entirely untrue of public transit. When things are empty and when traffic is light, you also get a more comfortable ride and get where you want to go more quickly. But there is an issue here. These people will typically say things like, if those buses are empty, you just shouldn't run them. Which makes a lot less sense when you're talking about a road or a highway, a fixed piece of infrastructure. We've already paid for it, so we can't save money operating it by, for example, implementing tolls or narrowing it to reduce the cost of road maintenance, anything like that. Okay, to be clear, sometimes it really is bad when vehicles are empty. If a bus is dirty or the service is so incredibly infrequent that nobody wants to use it, that's bad. The point of this video isn't that a bad service or an inconvenient or uncomfortable service is okay. It's that not all less than busy vehicles are experiencing that. I'll also say this before I dive into anything too deep. If you hear arguments like this, it's good to remind people that most cars are driven around by one person at a time, meaning they're only 25% full, and there are a lot more cars on the road in most major cities than there are buses. At the same time, massive amounts of our cities, even really good cities, are taken up for parking, for cars which are by definition doing nothing of serious value and also probably completely empty. The first thing you need to address with people when discussing this sort of situation is that, well, seeing an empty bus or two is pretty anecdotal. And if someone is of the general disposition that public transit is a waste of money, it's pretty likely there's some confirmation bias going on and that they just don't really remember the times they see a busy transit vehicle and vividly remember the times they see a wasteful, empty transit vehicle. Of course, as transit people, we know that it's pretty normal to see an empty vehicle from time to time on a transit system just by random chance. Maybe a bus is out of service, or it just left a terminal, or people got off it to change to another line. It's also possible that the section of a route where a person sees a vehicle traveling by is just not that high demand. I remember riding a suburban bus here in Toronto that was always empty when I got onto it, but immediately filled up over the next few stops as we passed by some major trip generators. The fact that a single bus trip can potentially serve multiple people who get on and then get off and then get on and then get off, all before the bus has even completed a single pass over the route, is just an example of transit actually being really effective at moving a lot of different people with fixed routes. Of course, though, as in my previous example, it's also possible that a service has just recently had its frequency increased or its schedule changed, and people do take time to adjust to such changes. Often it can take months, if not years, for people to change their travel patterns. These are things like where people find employment, where they live, and what kind of stuff they do in their free time. And that's doubly true in places like North America, where we might be building a new transit service where a good one didn't already exist, and so a lot less people are used to riding transit in the first place. It's also always true that when you operate a frequent transit service, or really any transit service, that some vehicles will be more busy than others. That's simply the reality of the sometimes random, sometimes not at all random way that people travel. But empty buses aren't a bad thing. they're actually really positive because they're service in a fully visible form. Imagine you're sitting out eating dinner on a patio and you don't see any buses go by. You're much less likely to think that, hey, transit might be an option for me than if you see a bus go by every 15 minutes or so. The same is true if you're working in a store and you see transit passing by frequently. Hey, maybe I don't need to drive to work and park next time, I can catch the bus. At the same time, part of why the busy vehicles are busy is because people on those vehicles know that, hey, if I miss my bus or train, I can always catch the next one, which, hey, might be less busy. As some really smart people commented on that article that, again, I've linked down below, these kind of vehicles could sort of act like a transit loss leader. Just because they in themselves aren't serving a ton of people doesn't mean they don't improve the overall quality of the transit network. Another great example of this is night buses, which I specifically talked about in this article. The existence of a night bus, or say more buses and a higher frequency service, might be the exact thing that allows someone who gets on a busy vehicle or who rides in a busier time to actually do that and travel. And so while you might not see that person traveling on one specific bus, it was the existence of that service and those vehicles operating on a regular basis that made it so that they could make the choice to take a different transit vehicle. And of course, by making transit service more frequent, accessible, and reliable, the most expensive services to operate, think mass transit systems and high-frequency transit routes, are less and less likely to be empty and more likely to be very well used. You can really see this logic at play if you imagine what would happen in a world where we followed this logic of, if a vehicle isn't full enough, we're just going to remove it and not have that service operate. Say you have a bus that's operating every 15 minutes and you just cut out 20% of the buses. Suddenly the services that do still exist got a lot more crowded, which makes people less likely to want to take them. And at the same time, your service simultaneously became much less convenient, again making it less likely that current riders actually use the system. And this is what leads to a transit death spiral. You have less frequent service, which leads to less ridership, which leads to people complaining that there isn't enough utilization of the resources, which creates a cyclical pattern where less people ride, less services delivered, and less people ride. This is why so many transit systems, even when they see a lot of investment, fail to get a significant amount of ridership. Now, you shouldn't take this video as me saying that transit vehicles running empty is necessarily a good thing, because of course we could always use more transit service and resources, and if a bus is running empty in one place, it could be running more full in another. There are a lot of different operational reasons you can see a vehicle running less full than it should, but one of the most common ones, especially on routes and services where you're operating frequent vehicles, is what's known as bunching. Bunching is also more common when you have a route that's on the surface that potentially has to deal with somewhat random factors like traffic signals. Essentially what happens is the delay on a vehicle begins to accumulate, and the less busy and more busy vehicles also have an effect on this. The more busy vehicles naturally travel a bit slower because more people are requesting to get off them. When more people have to get off, the vehicle travels more slowly, which allows more people to get to the stops before it arrives, slowing down boarding. This whole process slows vehicles down, allowing one vehicle, say the front vehicle, to travel more slowly and a vehicle following it to travel more quickly because it's going to a bunch of stops that already have had their passengers recently picked up. This leads to essentially vehicles following each other in pairs, where a busy vehicle will be followed directly by a less busy vehicle. Now, there are actually a lot of ways to deal with bunching in transit. For example, if no one requests to get off at a stop, a bus driver can bypass it, allowing the subsequent vehicle to pick those people up, slowing it down. Another option is to do things like add transit signal priority that's activated when a bus is running behind schedule. That way, when it reaches an intersection, it can keep flying through while the next bus takes its time. Of course, this can also be made worse to some extent when your transit is less frequent, because people are more likely to hold the door or try to wave down a bus and stop it so that they can get on. As we know, and as hopefully more of the public will eventually understand, some empty or underutilized vehicles aren't a sign of a transit system that's not working or wasting money. Sometimes it means that better, more involved management or control of different network operations is needed, and sometimes it just means things are working as intended. Thanks for watching.